Velkomin til Akureyrar. Welcome to Akureyri, Iceland's enchanting second city. Located on the country's north coast and just 100 kilometers below the Arctic Circle, Akureyri is a real gem. And on this walk around the city on a beautiful winter's afternoon, we'll admire the city's wealth of eye-catching landmarks and explore its captivating history, as we stroll through the modern city centre, past the spectacular Akureyri Church, through the tranquil botanical gardens, along icy paths with centuries of history, and around the charming Old Town, home to the city's museum and many of its oldest buildings. All of that is to come over the next 50 minutes, as we explore all that Akureyri has to offer. But we begin by taking in a view over the waters of the city's harbour, perhaps the most important spot in its history. The city of Akureyri is situated on the western bank of Eyjafjörður, one of the longest fjords in Iceland, providing stunning scenery as snow-capped mountains loom above us on all sides. But as well as beautiful views, the fjord, which stretches a good 60 kilometres inland, has created the conditions for an unusually mild climate this far north in Iceland. And as such, Akureyri's harbour here is usually ice-free, making it one of just a few places on the country's north coast where ships have been able to dock all year round. The high banks of Eyjafjörður also provide shelter for people and boats from the harsh winds and waves of the Arctic Ocean, a real natural benefit which has drawn thousands of people to settle here over the centuries. Today, Akureyri is home to just under 20,000 people, making it by far the largest settlement in Iceland outside of the densely populated capital region, which surrounds the city of Reykjavik. Akureyri, nearly 250 kilometres away from Reykjavik, is therefore often dubbed as the capital of North Iceland, and the main gateway to the majestic subarctic wilderness to be found along the country's north coast. But this part of Iceland is also well known for its maritime heritage, and just here by the harbour there stands a statue of a local fisherman, the large port having helped Akureyri to become one of Iceland's principal centres of fishing in recent decades. Like so many places in Iceland, Akureyri's history begins with the Vikings. The first Vikings are thought to have established a temporary settlement here on the shore of Eyjafjörður over 1,000 years ago in the 9th century, attracted by fertile land for agriculture and the sheltered natural harbour. A millennium later, the harbour sits at the heart of a sprawling urban area, and it's dominated by this rather modern building, simply known as Hof. Opened in 2010, Hof is built as Akureyri's premier cultural and conference centre, where concerts, conferences and more are held, many in celebration of the proud culture of North Iceland here. A counterpart to the mighty Harbour concert hall on Reykjavik's waterfront, Hof is a symbol of Akureyri in the 21st century, a fast-growing city which has emerged not just as a modern centre of fishing, but also tourism and education, home to just one of 7 universities in all of Iceland. If you're thinking of visiting or even studying here then, you'll likely want to know where you'd find Akureyri on a map. And so just here we can see the city, located near the bottom of the mighty fjord which stretches inland from Iceland's north coast. Akureyri isn't the only settlement on the shores of Eyjafjörður, however. There are a number of tiny villages and a couple of small towns within easy reach of this city. But that word, city, is one that's often a subject of debate when it comes to Akureyri. With nearly 20,000 people calling it home, Akureyri is indeed by far the largest settlement in North Iceland. But you'd be hard-pressed to call it a city, at least compared with the likes of New York City or London overseas. There's no official criteria in Iceland separating a town from a city, and so while Akureyri may be more townish on an international scale, it's a veritable metropolis compared with its surroundings, with a vibrant culture, bustling nightlife, and a real range of things to see and do. We'll see just a few of Akureyri's cultural highlights when we venture into the city centre. But here we're walking past a rather large house, which dates back well over a century to the year 1906. It's a wooden building clad in Norwegian stone, and for a long time it served as a commercial establishment serving the historic city neighbourhood of Oddeyri, just beside the harbour. As we mentioned, Akureyri has a natural, sheltered harbour, created by a protruding piece of land on the western shore of Eyjafjörður, known as Oddeyri Point. And in the late 19th century, as this city began to grow in size, Oddeyri Point was settled by a small community, made up mostly of merchants whose work was associated with the harbour itself. Today, Oddeyri is a primarily residential part of the city, spanning a number of blocks which emanate roughly from this point, where Lundargata and Strandgata meet. Now, we won't have time to explore Oddeyri in depth, but we know from Icelandic sagas that this neighbourhood was once upon a time an open field, mentioned in the sagas of the 13th century, and bearing the place name suffix eyri, meaning field. Fittingly, the city of Akureyri also bears the same place name element, this city's name literally translating as something like sandbank field, a reference to farmable fields which were found on the banks of the mighty Eyjafjörður. It wasn't just the harbour which attracted the first settlers to Akureyri after all. Iceland, a volcanic island with a harsh climate, is home to relatively little land that's adequate for agriculture. But Akureyri is a spot on the island with surprisingly fertile soil, and as we mentioned, an unusually mild climate. In the summer, this city is often warmer even than Reykjavik further south. Akureyri's unicorn climate has long been an important part of life here. The people of the city are well known for their interest in nature and gardening, and as we'll discover later, Akureyri is home to its own botanical gardens, an especially rare feature at latitudes this far north. But this is nothing new. People have been farming and gardening in Akureyri for over 1,000 years, although early Scandinavian settlements here were only temporary farming outposts. Merchants would live and farm the fields during the summer, and then return home to Norway and Denmark. It was only in the late 18th century that people began living in Akureyri year-round, and so it's only been about 250 years between the very first permanent settlement to the place that we know today, home to all the trappings of a modern city, including a grand old cinema just here, the Nýja having stood in the heart of the city since 1929. Apart from a brief period of closure after a major fire in the 1990s, the Nýja and its 2 screens have provided the people of Akureyri with the latest blockbusters from around the world for nearly 100 years, one of a number of popular cultural venues that you'll find here in the city centre. Elsewhere we'll find hip music venues, stylish bars and more, all of which form part of the city's famous nightlife. But just here we find ourselves strolling onto Akureyri's central square, Ráðhústorg, or Town Hall Square. Weirdly, despite the name, there's no town hall on Town Hall Square. It's actually a couple of streets further north. But the place where it was meant to be built is occupied by a branch of the National Bank now, as we can see just in front of us. Things are fairly quiet on the square as the sun begins to set over the city on this afternoon. But during the warmer months, this is the main venue for many of Akureyri's liveliest celebrations. Local graduation ceremonies take place on Ráðhústorg on the 17th of June every year, coinciding with the date when Iceland celebrates its National Day. For a long time, this was also the place where the bus from Reykjavik arrived into town, and where weary travellers would disembark after a roughly 7-hour journey all the way from the Icelandic capital. Nowadays, you can of course reach Akureyri from Reykjavik in a much shorter time. Flights between the 2 cities take around 40 minutes, and that puts the capital of North Iceland here within easy reach. For that reason, in recent years Akureyri has become ever more popular with tourists, and the city has responded with some delightful splashes of colour and culture on its streets. This, for example, is Hafnarstræti, which is home to many of the city's main bars, hotels and shops, as well as a number of fetching pieces of public art. These are the Twin Town sculptures, 5 small sculptures which symbolise the friendship between Akureyri here and 4 of its sister cities, Randers in Denmark, Lahti in Finland, Ålesund in Norway, and Västerås in Sweden. The bond between Iceland and its fellow Nordic nations is of course especially strong, and as we know, the city of Akureyri's origins can indeed be traced to Scandinavia, Norwegian and later Danish settlers establishing the community here on Eyjafjörður. Just beside the Twin Town sculptures, there stands Akureyri's favourite food stall, Pylsuvagnin, selling Iceland's favourite food, hot dogs. And just beyond it, we see a fetching mural daubed on the side of one of Hafnarstræti's buildings, one of the many eye-catching pieces of street art that you'll encounter as you explore this city. But it's not just artworks on the buildings that are certain to draw your attention. In some cases, Akureyri's buildings themselves are an utter delight. Just here, for example, there stands probably the cutest building in the city, Turninn, literally the tower, an ice cream kiosk with a small clock tower that's currently decked out all in pink. Although this little address on Akureyri's main street has had plenty of different colour schemes through the years, but always been popular with locals and tourists. Now, as we mentioned, Hafnarstræti here is home to many of the city's main hotels, bars and shops. If you're staying in central Akureyri, chances are that you'll be staying on Hafnarstræti, surrounded by a wealth of colourful buildings which provide plenty of things to do during the day and night. As we mentioned earlier, Akureyri is well known for its vibrant cultural sphere and nightlife, and during the summer months, although there isn't much night to speak of, the city comes alive, nowhere more so than at Akureyri's most popular independent music venue. This is Græni Hatturinn, the Green Hat, which many say is the best venue for live music in all of Iceland. It's no surprise then that the Green Hat has now been running for more than 20 years, with more than 2,000 performances from Icelandic and international musicians alike having taken place on the small stage inside this especially intimate venue, which is basically a cellar hidden at the bottom of a much larger and much older building. Clad in a deep blue coloured iron, the building which towers over the Green Hat is one of a number in Akureyri which is actually named after another world city. This is Paris, and it was built all the way back in 1913 as a large merchant store in the heart of the modern city. And over the years it's existed as one of Akureyri's largest and most famous shops, selling everything from clothes to toys. And today it's also home to a nice cafe, where you can put your feet up and relax on the city's main street. Now Hafnarstræti stretches right across the city of Akureyri, all the way into the old town about a kilometre away, which we'll be visiting later on in our walk. Historically, of course, the old town was the heart of life here, but in the early 20th century, the centre of Akureyri shifted northwards to where it is now. This fetching heart sculpture marks the traditional centre of the modern city, an open space historically known as Kaupvangstorg, or Commercial Square. Commercial Square developed at this point because it was close to the main pier in Akureyri Harbour, which was built in 1905, and so this was the perfect place for goods to be bought and sold, having either just come off boats or being ready to be loaded onto them. The large Kea building, the historic home of Akureyri's cooperative society, looms over the place where most of the city's commerce took place, and around which merchants built large houses and stores of their own, Paris being just one example. But the rise of bustling commerce in Akureyri was actually rather unusual. In fact, in the 1830s, just a few decades before this boom, the permanent settlement at Akureyri had a population of just 12 people, and it was written off by the King of Denmark as a failure. Things of course went on to change dramatically, and we'll pick up the story of exactly how a little later on in our walk. But standing on a hill overlooking Commercial Square, we can see one of the city's most famous landmarks of all, the striking Akureyri Church. The church, which was built back in 1940, stands at the top of a famous flight of 112 steps, and as such it stands tall over the city's skyline, visible from the harbour where we started out. Once upon a time, Akureyri Church was the largest church in all of Iceland, and it was designed in a dazzling style by one of the country's most famous architects, Guðjón Samúelsson, who described the hill on which it stands as one of the most beautiful places for a church that he had ever seen. Samúelsson, who also penned the design for famous landmarks like the National Theatre of Iceland and the mighty Hallgrímskirkja in Reykjavik, was instrumental in bringing a unique flavour to this now instantly recognisable church, which is said to hold plenty of hidden secrets within. If you venture inside the church, you'll find a variety of unusual features, including a ship hanging from the ceiling, a huge organ with 3,200 pipes, as well as a distinctive altar and a fetching stained glass window, which are often suggested to have originated not from Iceland, but from across the sea in England. Some say that Akureyri Church's main stained glass window originally formed part of the historic Coventry Cathedral in central England, a magnificent medieval building which was largely destroyed by German bombs during the Blitz, in fact in the very same year that Akureyri Church was opened. How exactly the window made it all the way from the English Midlands to North Iceland is a bit of a mystery, but the story goes that when the Second World War broke out in 1939, the people of Coventry removed the valuable stained glass windows from their cathedral and stored them safely in a nearby farm. Soon enough, however, the windows ended up on the antiques market, and they made their way to Iceland. Some were bought and remained in Reykjavik, while one was brought to Akureyri, when it was discovered that it was exactly the same width as the space for a window in this church, then still under construction. The window was the cherry on the cake for Akureyri's beautiful new church, which also offers some exceptionally beautiful views over the city centre and the waters of Eyjafjörður. At this point, near the bottom of the fjord, the two shores are about 1.5 kilometres apart, but there's no major settlement on the other side, compared with the city that sits beneath us just here. As we know, Akureyri's modern city centre developed in this area in the early 20th century, around the main pier and harbour where ships pulled into port. But the city is far larger than the area that we've explored so far. And so from Akureyri Church, we're now going to make our way southwards out of the modern city centre, and towards an area known as Gamli Bærin, the Old Town. The Old Town holds many of the keys to Akureyri's rather unorthodox history, just as the stained glass windows of Akureyri Church tell the story of Christ and the history of Iceland in beautiful pictorial form. We know that, like almost everywhere else in Iceland, Akureyri's history begins with the Vikings, and according to the sagas, this place was first settled in the 9th century by a man named Helgi Magri Eyvindarsson and his wife Þórunn Hyrna. The pair were from Norwegian heritage, but before coming to Iceland they actually lived in Ireland and the Hebrides, the islands that were once ruled by Norway but now form part of Scotland. The story goes that the man, Helgi, suffered from starvation as a child in the Hebrides, and as such he earned the nickname Helgi Magri, Helgi the Lean. Nourished better as an adult, Helgi married Þórunn Hyrna, the daughter of a Norse chieftain, and around the year 890 AD, the two set out from the islands surrounding Britain for Iceland, where permanent Scandinavian settlement was just beginning. Sailing around to the island's north coast, and then down through Eyjafjörður here, the married couple eventually settled in a spot about 12 kilometres to the south of central Akureyri, a small peninsula which they dubbed Kristnes, literally Christ's Peninsula. There they lived for the rest of their life, and today you'll find a number of references to Helgi and Þórunn, the founders of Akureyri, around the city, including a statue on the other side of town and a number of streets named after them. But here we're climbing the hill along a street named Eyrarlandsvegur. The street takes its name from Eyrarlandi, one of the largest farms that once existed in Akureyri, and today it's lined by a number of elegant houses, most of which date from the 1920s. As a prominent street, the rather large houses of Eyrarlandsvegur were originally home to many of Akureyri's most prominent figures, bishops, leading merchants and more, and they were privileged to live in a spot in town which offers some of the very best views of the local scenery, the house's front windows gazing out across the vast expanse of Eyjafjörður. As we've mentioned, this is one of Iceland's largest fjords of all, stretching around 60 kilometres inland from the Arctic Ocean. And while the mountains on its eastern shore, just across from us, may seem rather immense, it's actually here on the fjord's western bank that the mountains are taller, particularly further north towards the wild Troll Peninsula. On this street, we're climbing one of the many hills that make up the city of Akureyri. But despite the higgledy-piggledy terrain, there are pockets of land surrounding Akureyri which have long been considered among the best for agriculture in Iceland. The very best local farmland is to be found a little further inland, in valleys between the peaks and away from the harsh breezes on the shores of the fjord. But of course, as we can see from the density of houses at the waterside here, people were more intent on living close to the harbour, where the trade of not just agricultural goods, but also fishing took place. As we pass a fetching red and white house, built all the way back in 1911, fishing was a surprising latecomer to Akureyri's commercial sphere. The earliest settlers weren't actually that interested in fishing, and so it only began in earnest in the late 19th century, when locals noticed the gold mine that was swimming in the waters of the fjord. But that wasn't the only eureka moment in Akureyri's history. This beautiful viewpoint stands at the top of a canyon known as Barðsgil, and back in the 1930s, it was in a small house just at the bottom of the canyon that two local men cobbled together the very first television to ever exist in Iceland. The pair were an Englishman and an Icelander with a fascination for the newfangled technology of television, and with homemade equipment, they picked up transmissions which were coming all the way from Crystal Palace in London, becoming the very first people in Iceland to watch TV. Running down the side of the canyon, meanwhile, is a snowy path known locally as Glötunarstígur, which translates rather ominously as the road to destruction. The name comes from the fact that it was once the path that led towards a dance hall at the bottom of the hill, which attracted young students from Akureyri Junior College, and which some particularly traditional people at the school judged to be deeply improper behaviour. For that reason they termed it the Road to Destruction, because while dancing and merriment may have been all the rage at the bottom of the hill, education was the order of the day at the top here. And in a moment, we'll take a look at the historic junior college where students came from. In the middle of the road here, though, we find another local sculpture, this one depicting a figure known only as the Outlaw. The story of the statue tells of the outlaw, once banished from society for committing a crime, returning to town with his faithful dog by his side, his son in one hand, and the body of his dead wife draped over his shoulder. Sculpted by the famous Icelandic artist Einar Jónsson, the Outlaw is a compilation of the many stories of men and their families who were banished from local communities through time, and the harsh realities they faced contending alone in the depths of Iceland's rugged natural landscapes. Now, the statue may seem to provide a more sympathetic view of Iceland's outlaws, but for most people, these outlaws, known as útilegumenn, were among the most feared in the country, more so even than the mythological figures which haunted the country's wilderness. Being outlawed from society was about as severe a punishment as there was in early Icelandic society. Men charged with heinous crimes, ranging from kidnapping to sheep thievery, were ejected into the wild and threatened with death if they were ever seen again. Nowadays, outlawing is of course no longer used as a punishment. The last Icelandic outlaws are believed to have lived in the early 19th century. But once upon a time they were such a fixture in the nightmares of the country's people that many folk songs, stories, and even lullabies were written, telling of the horrors that outlaws could bring. Some of those tales will likely still be studied by the students at Akureyri Junior College, which we find just here. The school, which began life in the late 19th century, moved into this huge, majestic building in 1904, and more than a century later it remains in operation as the home of Akureyri's most famous school. Of course, over time the school has grown in size, prompting the development of more modern classrooms, but this gorgeous building, known as the Old School, is legally protected, serving as an important symbol of the city. As we know, students from the college once ventured down the road to destruction on nights out, although the route back up, leading to the school, was actually known as the road to education, and superstition dictates that any student walking up the road to education should never look back down the hill, for fear of failing their exams. There are plenty of other superstitions and traditions to come out of the historic school at the top of the hill here. But while we know that the road to education does lead up to the junior college, just across from these houses, and beside the old school building, you'll find probably the most quintessentially Akureyri spot in the whole city. These are the Botanical Gardens, a symbol of Akureyri's credentials as the so-called Green City of Iceland, and a place where locals have long held a strong fascination with plants and gardening. Now, despite its natural diversity, Iceland's harsh climate means that it's not a country with a wealth of plant species growing wild, and so that makes these botanical gardens, among the most northerly in the entire world, an especially rare and treasured feature. Of course, in the winter, the trees of the gardens are mostly bare, with the exception of a few evergreen species that we can see around us. But these beautifully curated botanical gardens are still a joy to explore whatever the weather, home to elegant features like this fountain, and an incredible array of both native and foreign plant species growing within the walls. In fact, there are more than 7,000 plant species to be discovered here. For locals and visitors alike, the botanical gardens serve as an oasis of tranquility just a stone's throw from the heart of the city centre. Entrance is always free, and the gardens are open every day. But Akureyri's botanical gardens also serve a wider importance too. The diversity of plant life, growing so close to the Arctic Circle, is of great interest to botanists, who often use these gardens as a litmus test to see how plants survive at latitudes this far north. Botany, and a love for plants, is of course something that comes naturally to the people of Akureyri. These gardens, which began life as a simple park in the 1910s, were only converted into a botanical garden in 1957, after the city purchased a plant collection that belonged to a local man. His name was Jón Rögnvaldsson, and from the 1950s onwards, he helped to transform this former park into the famous gardens that we know today. But not only do the botanical gardens host a wide variety of plant life, they're also home to some rather interesting buildings and monuments too. Just here, for example, we've stumbled across the local bandstand, a fetching little piece of shelter standing among the snow. Of course, it's a place where people eagerly congregate and relax during the warmer months, when these botanical gardens are bursting with colour on all sides. During the summer, the gardens not only come to life with flowering plants, but also a number of facilities, including greenhouses and more that are open to the public. And so, during the winter, as we are today, there's only one place in the gardens which remains open. The building that stands opposite the bandstand here is a cosy cafe, named List. Recently established, the cafe offers a delightful menu of coffee, cakes, chocolate and more, and it's often open late into the afternoons and evenings, making it a lovely place to sit back and relax as the sun goes down. Now you'll notice that the cafe is housed in a rather modern building, but one which mimics the style of some of Akureyri's oldest houses. And as we now begin to make our way out of the gardens, we're beginning to enter a part of the city where there are plenty of historic houses, the Old Town. As well as greenhouses, Akureyri Botanical Gardens are home to one of the city's oldest houses of all, a humble black cottage, which is known as Eyrarlandsstofa. Eyrarlandsstofa was built all the way back in 1848 for the farmers of Stóra Eyrarland, which, as we mentioned earlier, was once one of the largest farms in Akureyri. Now, for a long time, this house stood about 50 metres to the south of where it does now. And while it was moved to its current position in 1987, it's been largely preserved as it was nearly 200 years ago, when this city was home to just a handful of people. We know the story of Helgi Magri and Þórunn Hyrna, the first settlers of this area, all the way back in the 9th century. But unlike some other settlements in Iceland, there's no direct connection in Akureyri between the first settlers and the city that we know today. Settlement was usually temporary in the early days. People would come here for the summer to farm the fields, and then return to their homes in Scandinavia for the winter. And so for centuries there was nothing here but the shops and storehouses of merchants which were used to hold produce from the fields. Amazingly, permanent settlement only began in Akureyri in the late 18th century. The very first residential house was built here in 1778, when this historic farming outpost was set to be christened as a certified trading post by none other than the Danish king. The Danes had a tremendous influence on Akureyri. Settlers brought with them agricultural skills that are thought to have pioneered this city's famous love for plants and gardening. And as this was now a place of permanent settlement, they made great advancements like the growing of trees for timber and the growing of potatoes in the ground, helpful for sustaining the local population through the winter. Things were going well for the Danish settlers then. Living conditions were improving, agriculture was continuing, and a real town began to emerge on the banks of Eyjafjörður for the very first time. But it seems that it wasn't enough to satisfy the King of Denmark. By the 1830s, just 12 people lived in Akureyri permanently, and so the settlement was judged a failure by the Danish king, who stripped Akureyri of its status as a trading municipality, seemingly condemning it to ruin. Fortunately, this was just a blip in the city's rise to prominence. The farmland and natural harbour were just too good to waste. And so in 1862, Akureyri's status was restored, and development began to create the city that we know today. Of course, as we now leave the Botanical Gardens, the city that we know today is centred back around Commercial Square and Town Hall Square, a development which, as we learned, only happened in the first years of the 20th century. Before then, the centre of Akureyri was to be found further to the south, in what is now known as the Old Town, which we'll find just a short distance away at the end of this road. This road is still Eyrarlandsvegur, the road which began all the way back at Akureyri Church. But you'll notice that it splits in two just here, curving up the hill to the right, where you'll find Akureyri's main hospital. Now, the hospital today is far from the city's most attractive building, but while this modern hospital may not seem like much of a landmark, there has been a hospital in Akureyri for the best part of 200 years, historically located on the edge of the Old Town. From this point, a gap in the trees offers the perfect view back towards the harbour where we started, and Oddeyri Point, the natural sandbank which juts out into Eyjafjörður, and which was crucial in setting this place out as an ideal place of settlement. Still, the heart of settlement was not where it is today. The modern city centre is connected to the Old Town by this road, which is known as Spítalavegur, or Hospital Road. Now, the name for this way was coined back in the 1890s, when a new hospital was built in its present location at the top of the hill. But it wasn't the first to have been built in Akureyri. You'll notice that the buildings around us are starting to look a little older than the ones in the city centre, and that's because many date not from the 20th century, but the early 19th century, including the city's very first hospital, which was built back in 1835 a short distance away, and we'll see it in just a few moments' time when we reach the bottom of Spítalavegur. This short row of colourful houses, which actually still date from the early 20th century, are among a few which have Spítalavegur as their address. But the truth is that this historic road, leading in and out of the old town, is no longer a road in its entirety. In fact, as we find just here, Spítalavegur turns into a delightful footpath, which follows the contour of the hill, and which will take us down towards the old marketplace of Akureyri. Now, I say that this is a delightful footpath. It's fairly lethal on this chilly February afternoon, with months of compacted ice and snow making it a rather slippy way to reach the old town. But it's well worth braving a walk along this part of Spítalavegur, because this footpath is one of our first clear reminders of what life was like in Akureyri's old town, a small and fairly rudimentary settlement with few of the luxuries that the city possesses today. We know that permanent settlement began in Akureyri back in the late 18th century, when a controversial trading monopoly, which the Kingdom of Denmark held over Iceland, was abolished. This allowed for the creation of modern market towns, where people could support themselves by buying and selling goods all over Europe, and Akureyri was one of 6 market towns that were created in Iceland at this time, the others being Vestmannaeyjar, Eyjafjörður, Grundarfjörður, Ísafjörður and Reykjavik. These were the first towns in Iceland, at least as we understand the term today, although as we know they weren't much of a success initially. 5 of the 6 failed to grow, Reykjavik being the only exception. But before it had been stripped of its status, there had been big plans for Akureyri. Homes were built alongside the old merchant stores and farmhouses, and they surrounded a central marketplace, which was to be the heart of commerce and trade in this settlement. Historically, the marketplace was situated just at the bottom of Spítalavegur here, and we know this because there still remains an old boundary marker from the late 18th century. If you keep your eyes peeled, just at the foot of these evergreen trees, there stands a large grey boulder, which is known locally as Grásteinn. Now, Grásteinn is much smaller than it was originally. It was blown up in the 1890s to make way for the modern road up to the new hospital, but it historically served as a natural barrier to expansion, the effective endpoint for the old town of Akureyri. This path, then, was originally used by people to walk up the hill to the pastures where animals grazed and where crops were grown, because people lived almost exclusively on the shore of Eyjafjörður, and it was by the water that North Iceland's largest city began its story. Here we've reached the bottom of the perilous Spítalavegur and emerged out onto what was once upon a time Akureyri Marketplace, a former role which is still somewhat evident today, from the open space surrounded by houses. Once upon a time, many of these houses were shops. One was a school, and one was even home to the town clock, to which all the people of Akureyri would adjust their watches. Many of the buildings do indeed date back to the early 19th century, when urban growth was first kicking into gear here. Although once upon a time, these houses would have been a lot closer to the waters of the fjord. Historically, the shoreline was roughly here, where Hafnarstræti runs today, and so that means it was around this point that merchants would have moored small boats against dry land. This was long before the construction of piers to jut out into deeper waters and to allow larger ships to dock and offload goods. So merchants, likely carrying their goods by hand, were keen not to have to walk too far to store them, and so they built their houses directly on the shore here. With that in mind, it's clear why this is where we find the oldest building still standing in Akureyri today. This fetching little black house is known as Laxdalshús, named after a Danish shipping magnate who owned it in the late 19th century. But the house was built long before Mr. Laxdal. In fact, this house dates from 1795. It wasn't the first house in Akureyri, but it is the last remaining from the earliest era of permanent settlement, and it was originally built by a Danish man named Johan P. Hemmert, a leading merchant in the settlement at the time. In those early days, this wooden house would have been used primarily as a private home, and also as a local shop, but over the years it's taken on a number of different roles. In the 1820s, it became the town library, where locals could take books out free of charge, while in the 1940s, the local government bought it to be used to house homeless people, with room for more than 20 individuals. Today it's been beautifully preserved as a symbol of the city's proud history, Laxdalshús looking out over a playground which stands where water would have once lapped against the shore. Houses by the water here were prime real estate, but there of course wasn't space for everybody to live on the shore. So here we find a narrow path which will lead us up to the place where most houses in the old town were built. Bizarrely, this narrow lane is known as Breiðigangur, Broadway, and while it's undeniably a spitting image of its namesake over in New York City, the lane is a surprising survivor through Akureyri's topsy-turvy history, as one of just a few streets which was never destroyed by fire. Few of the houses on Broadway are as old as Laxdalshús, which escaped destruction by fire where many others did not. But Akureyri's old town, and the city's collection of historic houses, was once much larger than it is today. In 1901 and 1912, entire neighbourhoods of Akureyri were burnt down. The southernmost part of town, near the modern airport, completely wiped out, and a number of buildings which stood on the hill above this street also destroyed. Now this is Aðalstræti, Main Street, and it, like Broadway, appears to have largely escaped destruction by fire through time. In fact, Aðalstræti, which once looked directly out onto the shore, was once hemmed in between the water and the slope that we can see just here. But as the local population grew in the late 19th century, plans were made to create more space for people to live. This slope was once larger than what we see today, because much of the earth that made it up was dug out and moved over to the other side of this street, creating an area of landfill where new houses could be built. Just here, this blue house occupies a piece of land which once upon a time marked the very southern boundary of Akureyri, roughly where the very first house was actually built back in 1778. At this time, just a handful of people lived in Akureyri, but by the late 19th century, the population numbered in the hundreds, prompting the need for more houses and more local facilities, such as this, the Old Hospital, which was built back in 1835, and which is often touted as the very first two-storey building to stand in Akureyri. Originally, it was a merchant's house, and the building only came into use as a hospital in the 1870s, standing just next door to one of the old town's most beautiful buildings, number 16 Aðalstræti, which was built slightly more recently in the year 1900. The house's veranda once formed part of the public pavement, allowing people to stroll uninterrupted along Main Street and past the beautiful colours of the houses that line it. Like elsewhere in Iceland, many of these houses were originally built of wood, but were later clad in iron to provide insulation and protection against the elements, and they were painted in a variety of colours to stop the iron from rusting. Across the street, grand houses stand on landfill, which was created by moving earth from the slope opposite, most built in the first decade of the 20th century, as Akureyri's economic fortunes were continuing to improve. We know that farming, and the goods produced on farms, was an early driver of income for Danish merchants living here, but the Danes were surprisingly uninterested in developing fishing as a source of wealth as well. As we mentioned earlier, the fishing industry was a bit of a latecomer to Akureyri, beginning in the 1860s, when groups of Norwegians began settling here, and putting their fishing expertise to good use. Cut to the modern day, and Akureyri is one of Iceland's leading centres for fishing. Not only is this where fish are caught, but onshore facilities allow for the processing of fish, salting cod, smoking herring, and everything in between. As the town centre shifted northwards to where it is today, industry continued to boom. During the Second World War, the city was even the site of a major airbase used by a Norwegian-British squadron, sited in the far north of Iceland to defend against attack from German submarines, the Germans having originally earmarked Akureyri as one of the ports that they would capture first in their planned invasion of Iceland. That invasion never came, and the presence of the Allied air base prompted the development of more infrastructure and jobs that only helped this city to grow. Of course, much of that happened in the city centre and around Oddeyri Point, whereas here to the south of the old town, things are rather more sparse. These houses on Aðalstræti overlook a beautiful open space on the banks of the fjord, home to a vast lake known as Leirutjörnin. The lake, frozen over at the minute, is often a centre for many community events in Akureyri throughout the year. Memorial services, ice skating races and plenty more are held here, while during the summer the lake is often teeming with waterfowl, as ducks paddle amid the vast scenery of Eyjafjörður. Here we're looking southwards towards the very bottom of the fjord, roughly where Helgi Magri and Þórunn Hyrna settled at Kristnes all those years ago. And the scenery seems to contain the city of Akureyri in a kind of shell, shielding it from all the hardships to be found in Iceland's wilderness beyond. It's a spectacular setting for a city, and if you're a tourist, it's well worth venturing further up the fjord towards the Arctic Ocean on a boat trip, where not just fish, but whales swim in the water, and tiny pockets of civilization can be seen clinging to the fjord's banks. Akureyri, on the fjord's western bank, is no tiny pocket of civilization. Landmarks like the church, Hof and more are all visible from across the water. But just here there stands a fetching green-coloured house, which is another of the city's oldest. It was built back in 1856, and for a long time it served as the headquarters for a temperance movement organisation. But today it's home to Akureyri's Toy Museum, home to an immense collection of 20th century toys. The Toy Museum is one of a number of museums that you'll find to the south of the Old Town here. Closer to the city's airport, just over a kilometre from here, is the Icelandic Motorcycle Museum, the local Industry Museum, and the Icelandic Aviation Museum, all of which boast impressive collections that are well worth checking out if you have the time. But in the middle of Aðalstræti here, there stands the Akureyri Museum, dedicated to the city's history, and which also encompasses a couple of historic houses, one of which may be familiar to visitors coming from Germany. Back in the 80s, a popular children's TV show named Nonni und Manni was screened in West Germany, and it was based on a book written by an author who came from Akureyri, a reverend by the name of Jón Sveinsson. Sveinsson, otherwise known as Nonni, grew up in Akureyri, and his story tells of his adventures in Iceland with his brother, Manni. The family left Iceland in the 1870s, moving to continental Europe, but the memory of Nonni hasn't been forgotten where he grew up. This statue is dedicated to Nonni himself. The nickname Nonni is a common one for men called Jón in Iceland, but it's most synonymous with this man, who wrote his books in German, but which have been translated back into Icelandic, and which are well known across the country today. The German TV show tells Nonni's story of growing up in Iceland, but the books take him all over the world. There's Nonni in Japan, Nonni in America, and everything else. So if you're an international fan of Nonni, then you can't miss out on a visit to the Nonnahús, the author's childhood home. Hidden from view a few steps back from Aðalstræti and behind this lovely red house is the place where Nonni grew up in the 1860s. The house is another of the oldest in Akureyri. It was originally built by a local goldsmith in 1850, but today it celebrates Nonni, preserved by the city much as it would have been in his day. You can venture inside the house and learn even more about Nonni and his stories, exploring his childhood bedroom and a number of other historic spaces, with information available not just in Icelandic and English, but also German, showing the popularity of the stories over in mainland Europe. But the Nonnahús isn't the only historic building to be found in this part of the city. At the bottom of the slope here, there also stands a humble wooden church, known as Minjakirkjan, the Museum Church. It was originally built all the way back in 1846, although not here. The church used to stand in the village of Svalbarðseyri on the opposite side of Eyjafjörður. It was moved to the grounds of Akureyri Museum here in 1970, because it's a fantastic example of the kind of timber church that you'd have once found in rural communities across Iceland. Although the site on which it stands was once upon a time home to another church, the very first church built in Akureyri, which existed between 1862 and 1943. The opening of the space-age Akureyri church closer to the city centre in 1940 meant that the one here was no longer needed. But the quaint Minjakirkjan is still occasionally used for worship. Services are held here twice a year, at Christmas and at Easter. It's a delightful feature that sits in the grounds of Akureyri Museum, itself housed in a more modern building just at the top of the hill. But just outside the museum here is a small forest, which is home to yet more secrets. Just here there stand two cannons, but they're not a relic of some long-forgotten battle that took place in Akureyri. Instead, they come all the way from Sweden. They were made over 150 years ago in 1864 for use by the Danish army in a war with the Germans. But by the time they were finished, the war was over, and so they were later sold to somebody in Iceland and made their way to Akureyri here, where they're occasionally even used to fire ceremonial shots on special events. As we mentioned, a number of city events take place around the lake, known as Leirutjörnin here, and just beside the frozen waters of the lake, we find one more dazzling public sculpture, which stands with the grand scenery of the fjord as its backdrop. It's named Útþrá, and it was originally sculpted back in 1951, but was gifted to the city in 2016. Since then, it stood in this beautiful piece of open land just to the south of the city centre, a place where the views across the fjord are at their best, and as the sun begins to set, the place where we've reached the end of our tour of Akureyri. Perched on Iceland's north coast, and about 10 times smaller in size than the capital Reykjavik, the city of Akureyri is often a place that passes by visitors to Iceland. But as I hope you'll agree from having explored the city today, there's so much that makes it worth a trip. With a garden-loving population, a spectacular modern church, an array of gorgeous old houses, truly stunning natural scenery, and so much more, Akureyri is a worthy capital of North Iceland. And I hope that you're now looking forward to making your own trip to this magnificent city sometime soon.